For the first time ever, I'll be trying gouache paints. This type of paint is similar to watercolor, but let's explore their differences. Let's also check if these gouache paints from Mont and Tokyo Finds are good. I'm Rema and welcome to my art space. Watercolor and gouache are almost the same because they are both water-based mediums. Because they are water-based mediums, the only solvent they need is water. Even though these paints have dried, they can still be reactivated when water is applied. That's why I'm always careful to keep my watercolor paintings away from wet surfaces or damp places. Once it's soaked, it's ruined. I'm sure it's the same case with gouache. One of the differences of watercolor and gouache is that gouache is more opaque than watercolor. Watercolor paints, especially dark pigments, have the tendency to bleed through lighter colors. Light-colored gouache paints, on the other hand, has a thicker coverage, although the darker paint also has the tendency to bleed through when dampened by water. Naturalpigments.com said both watercolor and gouache paints are made of water, pigment, and gum binder. But gouache paints also have an addition of a white extender, one of the primary reasons it can become opaque. Now let's see how paintings made of watercolor and gouache paints can look like. Let's start with my favorite medium, watercolor. But before I begin painting, let me tell you a little story about this old watercolor set that I'm now using as my palette. I bought this at a small sari-sari or general merchandise store in the midst of a strict COVID-19 lockdown in 2020. I usually go for more expensive and higher quality art tools, but since all art specialty stores were closed, I had to settle on this one. I realized later on that this simple watercolor set saved my life from the depression and anxiety brought by the lockdown. That's why, until now, I'm still using this. Usually, we don't realize that God uses the things that we think don't have value. So don't be discouraged if other people think that your art or any of your works doesn't have value. Who knows when God will use that to encourage others. Now let's start painting. But I'll introduce to you first our model. I've used a light-colored pencil to make a draft of the subject. This is to ensure that it would not bleed through the paint. After dampening the canvas with water, I proceeded with the background. If you're adding too much water on the paint, there's a possibility that the paint can become uncontrollable. Because of this, parts of the brown paint dripped into the lower part of the picture, which actually I did not intend to originally. The white paint I used to color the brown part has actually been painted, so it's not pure white anymore on that part. Painting the tiniest details is always my favorite part of the painting process, but I would warn you that I really have bad lettering, so forgive me on this part. Placing shadows and light is also a tricky part for me because sometimes I get the angle wrong. This is one of the areas that I should practice more. To make sure that the dark part is covered by lighter color paint, I just paint that part over and over again. Also, I have to make sure that the lighter color of paint would not be diluted with too much water. I was able to finish this painting for about 2 hours. Phew! This is still picture number 1. I'm now excited to use these gouache paints from Mont and Tokyo Fines for painting number 2. As usual, I'll start painting the subject with a very light colored pencil. In painting the background, I noticed that the paint has thicker application, which I think is a good sign. However, gouache paints also have the tendency to become uncontrollable when too much water is applied. I'm now trying the titanium white paint from Tokyo Fines to see if it's able to cover the red drip. I didn't think the red drip was covered, so I'll try the Mont one. Apparently, Mont paints have better coverage compared to those from Tokyo Fines. I think the yellow paint from Tokyo Fines does not have very thick coverage. You can see the blue paint still bleeding through the yellow paint. So far, the only paints I bought from Tokyo Fines are white and yellow. So the rest of the colors that I'll be putting here in this painting are from Mont. Gouache paints make easy coverage, but because this paint has thicker values compared to watercolor, I was intimidated to make a good lettering out. Also, I quite had a hard time blending colors in gouache, but I think it takes more practice to master this part. Just like the first painting, this one lasted for about 2 hours. Both types of paint have their own strengths and weaknesses. I find that the watercolor is easier to blend because it is lighter and less thick compared to gouache. For the gouache, what I like for the gouache is that it's easy to cover up mistakes, although it's also prone to making mistakes because it's so thick. It can really cover up the paint. When it comes to blending, I like the watercolor more, but when it comes to coverage, the gouache is better. As for the gouache paints that I bought, if I would compare Mont and Tokyo Fines, it's the Mont that's the winner for me. So it has thicker coverage compared to Tokyo Fines. I think Tokyo Fines has more of the watercolor properties compared to the Mont gouache ones. If I'm going to use gouache, I'd rather use the Mont brand. As always, this brand has never failed. So that's a wrap for now. And thank you very much for joining me here. I hope you enjoyed this video and I also hope to see you again soon. Bye! Because these paints are water-based mediums, the only solvent because they are water-based. Let me tell you a little story about this. The neighbor is still noisy, you know, they're always noisy. Shh! Lizard says, you're also noisy, lizard.